What is going on, y'all? KM Best here. If you like mid-range decks with unpredictable finishing game plans, if you like playing a mid-range deck attached to cheating energy, you're gonna love what we have for you today. And also, it is one of the most successful decks in the game at high infinite. It has a 500 game sample size at top 10% infinite on Untapped with a 58% win rate in that sample size and a plus 0.55 cube rate. This is a deck that you should be excited to play. This is the list. It's a Pixie Anti-Venom list cooked up by Zombies Go Nom Nom. And the reason I'm so excited to talk about a deck like this is because on day one, this was already my most successful version of any Anti-Venom deck list. And I think there's a couple of things that we can learn about deck construction from this, but also in a much more straightforward manner, I think that you can just really understand why this list is strong when you look at the cards that are in it. You're not really giving up too much in terms of relative power compared to other decks. Right now, in order to be a mid-range deck like this, you need to be cheating energy in order to keep up with the stuff that is just going to go over the top of you otherwise. This energy cheat comes in the form of both Pixie and Anti-Venom. Now, both of those cards have cards that pair with them in the deck to go and obviate their downsides. Anti-Venom, of course, pairs with Luke Cage and Shadow King, while Pixie pairs with Mobius. The reason this is such a potent combination is because Luke Cage, Shadow King, and Mobius are all really relevant cards in the current metagame. Anyone who's playing anything similar to you is going to get got by Mobius. Anti-Venom itself is telling people to lean a little bit into the Luke Cage type stuff, which pushes them into some Luke Cage vulnerability, actually, because when you run Luke Cage, you want to run stuff that synergizes with it a lot of the time, which this deck avoids, but is able to capitalize on if you run into someone playing, say, Toxic Sarah. Reactive Sarah decks being on the upswing is another big point in favor of any deck actually running the card Mobius and Mobius. When people are relying on energy cheat, whether that be from Sarah or from Anti-Venom or from any number of cards, you can get a lot out of having relevant tech here. What I'm getting at is, this is a deck that mixes proactive game plans with Pixie and Anti-Venom with reactive tech cards that do double duty. Luke Cage is probably worth running in a deck like this right now anyway. Mobius is probably worth running in a deck like this right now anyway. But what you're doing is taking them and turning them from good tech cards into combo pieces that are also good tech cards. And that is a really powerful thing to bring to bear. The other thing that this deck does very well, that is better than almost every other deck of its type in the game, is be unpredictable on the final turn of the game. The big weakness of a lot of mid-range decks where the goal is just play one big guy on turn 5, play a guy, you know? They have very predictable turn 6s. Anti-Venom makes your otherwise predictable turn 6 wildly unpredictable and wildly stronger. Pixie has the same effect. This is a deck that has what looks like a predictable 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kind of game plan, but then by the time you get to turn 6, pretty much anything can happen. You can get Alioth and Magneto. You can get Lady Deathstrike and Alioth. You can get Lady Deathstrike and Magneto. There are a ton of different combinations of things. Even just, Luke Cage, Shadow King, free card is a powerful end-game game plan against some other decks. This allows this deck to go beyond what a normal mid-range deck can do. The weaknesses of a typical mid-range deck tend to be predictability and limited point ceiling. This deck gets rid of that predictability and gets rid of that limited point ceiling by cheating energy extremely hard. This allows it to do a ton of damage where other mid-range decks would fall short, either in terms of being predictable, like just playing a Magneto on the final turn of the game, alongside maybe some, whatever else Wicked lets you play, it's not really all that much, or in terms of allowing you to have a higher point ceiling, because this will get you a higher point ceiling when it hits the right stuff. The final card that I think is really worth mentioning in terms of metagame positioning right now that makes this deck legitimately good is, of course, Lady Deathstrike. Now, one of the things that you'll notice about a deck like this is a fundamental weakness to Mobius and Mobius. But unlike Luke Cage, who can sort of show up at the end of the game and have his full effect, Mobius actually needs to be on the board to matter, and that means that you can blow him up with Lady Deathstrike and maintain the power that this deck is attempting to bring to bear. This kind of playline allows this deck to not only pack relevant tech cards for the metagame, but pack relevant anti-tech cards for what it's trying to do. This is not just a card that is relegated to blowing up Mobius, though. It can blow up your opponent's Iron Man a lot of the time. It blows up everything that got hit by Bast. It can blow up their lane full of Madam Web stuff. There's a ton of very powerful targets for Lady Deathstrike in this current metagame, and I think that she is sort of the secret weapon of this deck right now. So, with all of that said, this video is going to be slightly different than my other videos. I got a lot of feedback recently that people were not necessarily watching all of the gameplay, so I'm going to put that to the test. A lot of the time, when you do YouTube, you make what you think is good content, and if it succeeds, and if it doesn't, it doesn't. I've been doing pretty well for myself by putting the gameplay on the end of the video. A bunch of people in the comments said, I really only watch during the commentary anyway. So, what I'm going to do is try to double down on making this an in-depth commentary and then not put gameplay on the end of the video until my gameplay is up to par. We'll see how this video does, and I'll sort of judge what I'm going to do about my format based on how this video does, basically. I know that it's very common for people in YouTube comments to give opinions and then have them not really be backed up by viewing, right? Like, I got a lot of good feedback on my worst cards, or best cards in Marvel Snap history review. All the comments were like wildly effusive in their praise, but it was still like my least clicked on thumbnail of the last like 10 or 12 videos, maybe even more. And so that didn't translate into actual success for me. I'm interested to see what this one does, and I hope you appreciate the transparency. I'm just trying to, deliver what you want. And with that said, let's get into the card-by-card breakdown. Nico Minoru was powerful for me. I don't think she was make or break in this deck the way you might expect her to be. I read her more as generic strong card that happens to cost 1, but honestly, I think you could very easily replace her with something like Silver Sable and be happy about it. I was very rarely getting a lot of value out of this card, and I think this inclusion might be a sort of relic of just how I think about this card as like a generic one-drop that needs to go in everything, but it doesn't actually have to be that anymore. Obviously, if you are a Pixie deck, you care a lot about having some one-drops in the deck. The Nico upsides are like sometimes you get to like play Nico on turn 1 for draw 2, and then you get a Pixie on turn 2 and you destroy the Pixie and draw 2. Stuff like that is really good. Demon on turn 1 is really good. And most of the time she just ends up being a 1/4 anyway, which means maybe she's like not even all that much worse, or sometimes she ends up being better than the equivalent Silver Sable. But I am just sort of stuck on the idea that I'm very rarely like really popping off with this card. This is like a workman's Nico. This is like a bring your lunch pail to work Nico. This is a blue collar Nico Minoru. This is not a Nico Minoru where she is like a snap conditioner really popping off. Very rarely you'll get like a really cool copy after a Pixie of something that is undercosted and cheap. That can happen, it's cool. But honestly, a lot of the time, it's just like, I feel like I should be holding her, and I think maybe you're just supposed to play her every time she ends up being a 1/4. Like, maybe you're just never supposed to greet her, and you're just supposed to play her every time she's a 1/4. That is either doubling herself or giving +2 to something else, and just, like, get the points on the board, and that's really important for you. There are some downsides there, of course, like you are a Shadow King deck, and that does provide a sort of negative incentive for you to play a Shadow King in that lane, which your opponent can't take advantage of in their positioning, which is not always the greatest thing for you to deal with, honestly, a lot of the time. I am torn. I can't tell if I'm necessarily playing this card wrong, or if the deck would be easier to play, and maybe easier to play means better if I were to replace it with Silver Sable. But I will say, if you don't have Nico, I do not think it's make or break here. You can probably just play any utility one-drop, like I don't know, an Iceman or a Spider-Ham would probably get some similar work done, I think. Hydra Bob is a 1/5, which makes him sort of an auto-include in a deck that really cares about stats, especially in a metagame that really cares about stats. People ask about Hydra Bob replacements. Obviously, Silver Sable comes to mind, but again, I think it's reasonable to say if you don't have Hydra Bob, you're simply not getting enough stats out of any replacement. Like, what makes Hydra Bob so cool is that you can play him as a 1/5 alongside like a Pixie card or whatever, and you can get like a lot of extra power out of that because he is a 1/5. That's a really good ratio, right? He's also one of your few ways of, like, actually moving into other locations. Like, if you have a closed-off location, a Sanctum Sanctorum, a Death's Domain, this is going to be a card that's actually quite important for you. In the absence of this card, the same replacement rules that I talked about for Nico apply here. You might just be better off playing a Spider-Ham, playing an Iceman, going for a utility 1-drop, looking to disrupt your opponent's game plan, because there isn't really a good one-to-one replacement for this guy. One of the biggest mistakes I see people make is instead of just saying, all right, I cannot replace what this card does specifically, any budget replacement is so much worse as to not actually fill the role. They do a budget replacement instead of just saying, it's not worth doing a budget replacement. I need to find a different role for this card slot to fill. And for that reason, I think my replacement for this would probably be Spider-Ham. Like, this is not a replacement one-to-one for Hydra Bob. It is a card that is doing something totally different. The only thing they have in common is their energy cost. But there is such a lack of actual Hydra Bob replacements in a one-to-one, this is doing the same thing kind of way, that I think you probably just have to go a completely different direction. I still remember when I had Glenn Jones on my show, and he was suggesting that they kind of wished they could have buffed Pixie, and that was like the week before Pixie broke out into prominence and basically never looked back. I have often thought that Pixie is best paired when Mobius has additional upside. Like, the general metagame conditions for Pixie to succeed are when you want to be playing Mobius otherwise, and this is one of those metagames. You have not only the very common Sarah Tech decks, you have decks playing Black Swan where he's like incidentally relevant, you have decks playing Scar where he's like incidentally relevant, you have decks playing Anti-Venom where he's incidentally relevant. There's a lot of just good splash damage you get out of playing Mobius, and a lot of Mobius Pixie decks tend to key on metagame conditions that make that a more beneficial card to run. Because obviously, you know, Pixie's a 2-1, Mobius is a 3-3. You need to be getting extra value out of this stuff. And the easiest way to make sure you're getting extra value out of this stuff is to say, my Mobius is playing for more than just a 3-3. It is more valuable than just that. It is a meaningful and powerful disruptive piece in the metagame. A lot of the time, I've found that if you just take Pixie Mobius out of some of these decks, they end up performing better. I tried that with this deck. It was worse. It was way worse. So both pieces of it are relevant here. The Mobius itself is quite good right now, but also the Pixie is important to increase your range on the final turn of the game and increase the potential power output of this deck, because you need that in some matchups. It is rare for you to be able to just like curve out and win the game. You need to be doing something weird. You need to be anti-venoming, you need to be pixieing, you need to be cheating a little bit. And that is why I think Pixie is the right choice for this list. Shadow King might not be the best card in the game, but if you told me you thought he was, I really couldn't get mad at you for it. Obviously, this is a powerful card. Obviously, this is a ridiculous card to play right now. Obviously, it got a buff for what I can assume is no reason at all. This is the premier tech card of the format, and you get to play it just because you get to play it. And of course, it has massive upside with Anti-Venom. It can reset that card to its full power if you need that to happen. There is so much green power in the metagame right now. Just an absolutely colossal amount of green power, whether every Agent Venom deck is being looked at or the variety of other decks that are similarly leveraging green power procs. Cravens and Screams will all get hit by this. Shadow King is one of, if not the defining card of this metagame. The only competitor to him is Agent Venom, in my opinion. And the fact that you not only run him as a reactive tech piece, but even in a matchup where he is irrelevant, of which there are very few, you can use him proactively to restore the stats from the card you anti-venomed. That is amazing. Any deck that has a card this good doing double duty is in a great spot. Luke Cage is a very powerful tech card in the matchups where he's good. That is kind of goes without saying. He's nearly an auto win against most Ajax type decks in the game. Just an extremely strong card. in those scenarios. But what makes him a card that we want to run specifically is also the fact that he restores our power from Anti-Venom. A lot of what I said about Shadow King also applies to Luke Cage. Shadow King obviously a little bit stronger, a little bit more relevant, but Luke Cage is a card that a lot of decks are happy to have in them, and I think that's the real thing that makes this so powerful, right? The Anti-Venom Luke Cage thing is very similar to the Pixie Mobius thing, where it's like, if you are in a good meta for Luke Cage, having Anti-Venom in it pushes it over the top. And I think that's what's happening here, basically. It's like, we're already in a pretty okay meta for Luke Cage. There's people playing Toxic Sarah, there's people playing a bunch of Ajax decks, US Agent is running around. There's a lot of different ways for people to apply negative power to you. We've probably never seen this much Man-Thing play ever, honestly. And Luke Cage is allowing you to completely not care about any of that stuff. It does not matter to you anymore. And when those afflictions are taken away from that deck, they're playing a 4/7 and a 5/7. And that is the kind of thing that you can mid-range out of the game 100% of the time. In addition, you have this Anti-Venom thing, right? You have your 4/7, and it gives you a free dude. Your dude is just free, and then Luke Cage makes it so there is no downside to that. Extremely, extremely powerful card right now. Excellently positioned and very good with Anti-Venom. Owen Wilson saying wow is the only real reaction I think one can have to the power of Mobius M. Mobius right now. He is just a strong, relevant card in a variety of different matchups. Like I discussed when we talked about Pixie, Pixie and Mobius sort of rise and fall with the relevance of Mobius, not necessarily the relevance of Pixie. Right now, both of them are relevant. Pixie for providing a additional high roll impact, allowing you to compete with decks that have a very high point ceiling, and Mobius for shutting down everything that's based on trying to discount right now. It's not like either of these cards are Shadow King, right? Like, of the group of tech cards that have other synergies in here, Shadow King, Mobius, Luke Cage, Shadow King is by far the best of them, right? Like, it just is. It is a 2/3. There is more green power. It is more relevant. It is more aggressively costed. It is better. But these cards are very strong right now, and the upside you'd be gaining by just running stats cards instead, things like Gladiator maybe, or Copycat. First of all, Copycat's already in here, but second of all, like, I kind of tried that, and it did not work out for me. I genuinely do think that the relevance of cards like Mobius and Luke and Shadow King is what makes this deck good right now. The fact that it is able to have a deck full of extremely meta-relevant tech, answers to your opponent's versions of those meta-relevant tech in the form of Lady Deathstrike, and a very powerful high-roll game plan is what allows this deck to succeed, and Mobius is an integral part of that. You don't necessarily always want to be in the business of like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 curving out, but if you are going to be in that business, which you have to be some of the time because you just don't draw that well all the time, Copycat is a great way to be in that business. One of the most aggressively costed, aggressively statted 3-drops in the game, a 3/5 with additional upside that gives you not only information on what the bottom card in your opponent's deck is, so you don't have to necessarily play around that, but also scales well above her 3 energy if the hit is good. Even hits of stuff like, Silver Sable make this a 3/7 to 3/9, depending on if they play the card you Silver Sabled. A lot of meta-relevant cards are good to hit off Copycat because they're meta-relevant because they're strong. That's the baseline premise of this card, is your opponents are playing cards that are good. And we saw a lot of this dynamic actually with Loki, where the basic premise of Loki was like, yeah, if you built to beat Loki and you were finicky enough, Loki would very often be bad. But that wasn't a reliable enough thing that people were actually willing to do. So Copycat has a similar dynamic. Most of the cards your opponents are playing are pretty good. And so if you get the effect of something pretty good on something that is already pretty good, then it's pretty good twice. And sometimes you get the effect of something that's really good on something that is already pretty good. You get a 3/5 Iron Man, a 3/5 Claw, stuff like that. Really, really powerful thing to do. Ridiculously powerful thing to do. Because then, A, you have that and you know they don't. And that's a really, really important information advantage to leverage as well. I'm going to say something controversial. The last time I feel I have felt this differently about a card than the general consensus was Ajax. Now, in that case, I was right. I don't feel as strongly about Anti-Venom being good as I did about Ajax. With Ajax, I was very confident. I was like, okay, everyone else is flat out wrong. This card is straight up good. I don't necessarily feel that way about it. Ajax, especially being like a package that can go in a lot of stuff, is a little bit more obviously good to me. Anti-Venom is more limited. He goes in certain decks. Those decks tend to look a lot like this. But I do find it hard to believe that I'd be playing those decks or want to be playing those decks without him. A lot of people looked at this and were like, well, how is that not just Iron Lad? And the answer is the card itself is actually free. If Iron Lad copies a Magneto, that's not 12 power. Like, you get to actually play the card for free and then remove the downside with a Luke Cage or a Shadow King. That is the fundamental difference that people I don't think were really grasping earlier. I think this card, I would be pretty surprised if I didn't see like a fair amount of this in, Sarah decks, right? If I didn't see a fair amount of this in decks like this. Like, this is the kind of card that will probably start showing up places that, again, it's not like it's going to be all of the metagame. It's not like it's going to be the best thing to do. It's not like it's going to be everywhere. It's not like it's going to be that. But it is the kind of card that I think if you end up not getting it, you'll be like one card away from a really cool Sarah deck or a really cool mid-range deck in the future. That's the vibe I'm getting off of this card. Obviously, it's Friday. You don't need to make your decision now, and I don't want you to make your decision now. I obviously would encourage you to wait, to think, to take your time. That's always the smart thing to do. But I am getting the sense of a disconnect between my estimation of this card and the community's estimation of this card that I have not felt since Ajax. And to be clear, Ajax, I was an order of magnitude more sure. I was very sure about that one. I'm way less sure about this, but I still feel a little bit disconnected from the community where the consensus seems to be that it's crap and unworkable, and that, I feel, is definitely not true. Man-Thing's buff is one of the most underrated things that Second Dinner has ever done. This card went from being almost totally unplayable to being part of like a linchpin package in the format. Like Man-Thing, US Agent, Luke Cage, Ajax, Hazmat is a package that is in so many decks right now. It's just incredibly, incredibly powerful, right? It obviously has a little bit less relevance right now than it did when everyone was playing Wiccan, when you'd play like 4 1-drops and 3 2-drops and 3 3-drops, and this card would hit like 75% of the deck. It's a little bit less right now, but it's still hitting basically 100% of the deck against, like, say, a bounce deck. It's hitting like 80% of the deck against the Iron Man Agent Venom deck. Like, it's hitting a large percentage of the deck and most of your early plays against most decks, right? And so this ends up being a 4-7, a 4-9, a 4-11. It's a big guy, and being able to have this kind of power at your fingertips, it's really strong. This is a really, really, really strong card that does a lot of powerful stuff. It's just a numbers machine. It does a ton of numbers. Lady Deathstrike is kind of the secret sauce of this deck, in my opinion. It allows you to deal with the cards that impact your cards negatively. Your opponent's Luke Cage might be making your Man-Thing not work. Your opponent's Mobius might be making your Anti-Venom not work. Well, they work now. They definitely work now. And Lady Deathstrike is just an incredibly powerful card right now because there is so much happening that is the kind of stuff she can blow up. If you can accelerate her out, she's even better. Like, obviously, if you get like a pixied cheapo Lady Deathstrike, you're playing her for like 2 or whatever, that's absurd. It's an extremely powerful thing to do. But this is just a straight up good card a lot of the time in order to unlock the rest of your cards. There are people who are going to be playing certain tech cards against you, and this deck will beat them. I know I said I was going to be trying to go a little bit more in-depth here, but like, I don't really know how in-depth we need to go about everyone's favorite purple fart cloud. We all know what this card is. We all know what this card does. We all know how powerful it is when you get to play it for free or for cheap. That should be fundamentally very clear to you. One thing I will give you as a piece of advice, though, is don't get too married to actually making the effect happen if you're in the type of game where it doesn't need to happen. Especially if you're not going to be able to play the card or get priority. I have been in the position where it's like, I kind of just need to play this as a 3/10 and not actually get the stuff, because if I don't play it as a 3/10, I won't have priority anyway, and it won't impact the board. And so there is something to be said about not being overly greedy with this card. Like, obviously, it's amazing if you can get priority, but your deck's not actually as good at that as you think. Like, this is a deck that has to play very carefully for priority because of the amount of 2/1s and 3/3s that it runs, right? This is part of why Hydra Bob can be so useful, is that it is a threat to take priority with this card as the sort of waiting in the wings doom. And this is a card that I honestly feel like maybe we don't use as well as we could. I'm not saying I'd want to like replace it or anything, but I have felt that like of the Alioth decks I play, I feel like I'm behind on priority a pretty decent amount with this deck, and I'm using cheating with energy in order to make up for that. Now, you can do the energy cheat stuff on turn 5 if you have the right setup for it, right? Like if you have a loot cage already and you can like just dump your like free cards out and try to take priority on 5 so this guy is good. That's the other line you're going to have to consider. You have to like really think about whether this guy's effect is actually going to happen. And if not, what are you going to do about it? Magneto is really big and he has a really cool effect. And if you ever get him off of Anti-Venom or cheap off of a Pixie, he's one of the best cards in the game. And frankly, he's one of the best cards in the game without it. The thing that this deck lacks mostly is the ability to go super tall, competing with things like Iron Man, various Agent Venom decks, things like that. When you get a cheaty Magneto, a cheaty Lady Deathstrike, a cheaty Alioth, that's the sort of power play that this deck needs to vault itself in front and never let go. Magneto is excellent at accomplishing this goal, an immensely powerful card, a very big guy with a very useful effect that is unbelievably busted when you get him early. All right, y'all, thank you so much for making it through that video. This is normally where I would throw it to gameplay, but like we discussed, we're not going to put gameplay on this one because I wanted to test and see whether you guys meant it when you said most of what you listen to is just the first part of the video where I'm doing the deck breakdown. I'm interested to put that to the test in a real way, and let me know in the comments what you think. But if I'm going to be honest, I'm probably going to be trusting the analytics on this one. I've learned that comments might be misleading. That said, we're going to give it a shot, so let me know if you want more of this type of content. The easiest way to make that happen is to like and subscribe and watch the whole video. Thank you so much. I have been KM Best. You have been phenomenal, and I will see you in the next one.